Welcome back. I hope some of you are actually back after that deep dive last week. Philosophy is complex and confusing. Often these concepts are part of a whole year-long philosophy course, so good job for hanging with me. Today we're going to talk about the nature of justification. How do we know we're justified in a belief? Justification is a concept in epistemology used to describe beliefs that one has good reason for holding. In other words, you are justified, you have good reason for holding a belief, whether it turns out to be a true belief or not. So last week, we talked about the Gettier problem. The view that knowledge was justified true belief was widely held by philosophers. So the idea that to have knowledge, you just had to have a justified true belief. So if you have a justified true belief, a belief that turns out to be true, and you have a good reason for holding it, you are said to have knowledge. But this guy Gettier showed that there were cases of a justified true belief that did not appear to be knowledge. Thus, the Gettier problem shows that justified true belief is not a sufficient condition for knowledge. In other words, something else is needed as well. So let's talk about the nature of justification. So one reason that the Gettier problem is so problematic is that neither Gettier nor anyone who preceded him has offered a sufficiently clear and accurate analysis of justification, how you are said to be justified in having a belief. We have said that justification is a matter of a belief's having been formed the right way. But we have yet to say what that amounts to. You may have noticed that last week. We're going to consider this matter more closely. So we have noted that the goal of our belief-forming practices is to obtain the truth while avoiding error. So how we try to gain knowledge, how we have beliefs about anything from how the world was made, to who a good politician would be, to what is a healthy practice, anything, we have a way of gaining information to process in our heads to then form a belief about, I need to eat less red meat, or whatever it is. So we want to try to have these beliefs to obtain truth while avoiding error. And that justification is the feature of beliefs which are formed in such a way as to best pursue this goal. You want to be justified in any beliefs you hold and not just have beliefs for the sake of having them. So if we think then of the goal of our belief-forming practices as an attempt to establish a match between one's mind and the world, and if we also think of the application or withholding of the justification condition as an evaluation of whether this match was arrived at in the right way, then there seem to be two obvious approaches to construing justification, namely in terms of the believer's mind and in terms of the world. Okay, so belief is a mental state, and belief formation is a mental process. Accordingly, one might reason whether or not a belief is justified, whether that is, it is formed in the right way. You went about getting your belief in a logical, good, well-reasoned, responsible way. That can be determined by examining the thought processes of the believer during its formation. So such a view maintains that justification depends solely on factors internal to the believer's mind, and that's called internalism. The term internalism has different meanings in other contexts. Here it'll be used strictly to refer to this type of view about epistemic justification. So according to internalism, the only factors that are relevant to the determination of whether your belief is justified is your other mental states. After all, an internalist will argue only an individual's mental states, her beliefs about the world, her sensory input, for example, her sense data, and her beliefs about the relations between her various beliefs can determine what new beliefs she will form. So only what's already there is going to influence, and things internal are going to influence how you form beliefs. So only an individual's mental states can determine whether any particular belief is justified. In particular, in order to be justified, a belief must be appropriately based upon or supported by other mental states. So as both Socrates and Descartes stressed it's not rational to believe P without possessing a good reason for believing P, so suppose I believe that Hershey's stock will drastically fall tomorrow. It's reasonable for you to ask why I think that's true. Clearly it's wrong to repeat myself saying, I believe that is true because it's true. So it seems I must have a reason distinct from my original belief for thinking that Hershey's stock will fall. Whatever I can appeal to will be something I am aware of in my own other mental state. Moreover, I can't merely appeal to another belief. For example, well, Karen told me Hershey's stock will fall. I need good reason for thinking that Karen is a good indicator about these sorts of things. Apart from that supporting belief, it's not rational to believe that Hershey's stock will fall tomorrow. So rationality requires good reasons that indicate a belief is true. The appeal to the Socratic Cartesian project is a way to motivate the claim that it is a basic fact that rationality requires good reasons. So this raises the question of what constitutes that basing or support relation between a belief and one's other mental states. We might want to say that in order for belief A to be appropriately based on belief B, or beliefs B1, B2, B3, whatever, the truth of B must suffice to establish the truth of A. In other words, B must entail A. We'll consider the relationship between beliefs and sensory inputs later. So, however, if we want to allow for our fallibility, we must instead say that the truth of B would give one good reason to believe that A is also true, by making it likely or probable that A is true. An elaboration of what counts as a good reason for belief, accordingly, is an essential part of any internalist account of justification. However, there is an additional condition that we must add. Belief B must itself be justified, since unjustified beliefs cannot confer justification on other beliefs. Because belief B must also be justified, must there be some justified belief C upon which B is based? If so, C must itself be justified, and it may derive its justification from some further belief D, and so on, and so on. The chain of beliefs deriving their justification from other beliefs may continue forever, leading us in an infinite regress. While the idea of an infinite regress might seem troubling, the primary ways of avoiding such a regress may have their own problems as well. This raises the regress problem, which begins from observing that there are only 4 possibilities as to the structure of one's justified belief. 1. The series of justified beliefs, each based upon the other, continues infinitely. 2. The series of justified beliefs circles back to its beginning. A is based on B, B on C, C on D, and D on A. That's not good. 3. The series of justified beliefs begins with an unjustified belief. Also not good. 4. The series of justified beliefs begins with a belief which is justified, but not by virtue of being based on another justified belief. So these 4 alternatives seem to exhaust the possibilities. That is, if one has any justified beliefs, one of these 4 possibilities must describe the relationships between those beliefs. As such, a complete internalist account of justification must decide among the 4. So, let's consider each of those 4 possibilities above. Alternative 1 seems unacceptable because the human mind can contain only finite many beliefs, and any thought processes that leads to the formation of a new belief must have some starting point. Alternative 2 seems no better, since circular reasoning appears to be fallacious. It's a logical fallacy, something we'll talk more about in a few weeks as we dive into critical thinking and argumentation. Alternative 3 has already been ruled out since it renders the second belief in the series, and thus all subsequent beliefs, unjustified. That leaves alternative 4, which must, by process of elimination, be correct. This line of reasoning, which is typically known as the regress argument, leads to the conclusion that there are two different kinds of justified beliefs: those which begin a series of justified beliefs, and those which are based on other justified beliefs. The former, called basic beliefs, are able to confer justification on other non-basic beliefs without themselves having their justification conferred upon them by other beliefs. As such, there is an asymmetrical relationship between basic and non-basic beliefs. Such a view of the structure of justified belief is known as foundationalism. In general, foundationalism entails that there is an asymmetrical relationship between any two beliefs. If A is based on B, then B cannot be based on A. Accordingly, it follows that at least some beliefs, namely basic beliefs, are justified in some way other than a way of relation to other beliefs. Basic beliefs must be self-justified or must derive their justification from some non-doxatic source such as sensory input. The exact source of the justification of basic beliefs needs to be explained by any complete foundationalist account of justification. Basically, there are some foundational beliefs that aren't just reasoned out and you build from there. That's foundationalism. In other words, there are some foundational true beliefs from which we eventually build out all our other ones. It's a very Platonic thought. So internalists might be dissatisfied with foundationalism since it allows for the possibility of beliefs that are justified without being based on other beliefs. Since it was our solution to the regress problem that led us to foundationalism, and since none of the other alternatives seem palatable, we might look for a flaw in the problem itself. Note that the problem is based on a pivotal but hitherto unstated assumption, namely that justification is linear in fashion. That is, the statement of the regress problem assumes that the basing relation parallels a logical argument, with one belief being based on one or more other beliefs in an asymmetrical fashion. So an internalist who finds foundationalism to be problematic might deny this assumption, maintaining instead that justification is the result of a holistic relationship among beliefs, not just a one-to-one linear correspondence. That is, one might maintain that beliefs derive their justification by inclusion in a set of beliefs which cohere with one another as a whole. A proponent of such a view is called a coherentist. A coherentist then sees justification as a relation of mutual support among many beliefs, rather than a series of asymmetrical beliefs. A belief derives its justification, according to coherentism, not by being based on one or more other beliefs, but by its virtue in a set of beliefs that all fit together in the right way. The coherentist needs to specify what constitutes coherence, of course. It must be something more than logical consistency, since two unrelated beliefs may be consistent. Rather, there must be some positive support relationship, for instance, some sort of explanatory relationship between the members of a coherent set in order for the beliefs to be individually justified. So coherentism, though, is vulnerable to the isolation objection. It seems possible for a set of beliefs to be coherent, but for all those beliefs to be isolated from reality. Consider, for instance, a work of fiction. All of the statements in the work of fiction might form a coherent set, but presumably believing all and only the statements in a work of fiction will not render one justified. Indeed, any form of internalism seems vulnerable to this objection, and thus a complete internalist account of justification must address it. Recall that justification requires a match between one's mind and the world, and an inordinate emphasis on the relations between the beliefs in one's mind seems to ignore the question of whether those beliefs match up with the way things actually are. If you are completely diving into a world of fiction or conspiracy and all those beliefs seem to match, but it's isolated from actual reality, you're not going to actually have any justified beliefs. So you may not like internalism, but good news, there's another option. So one might think focusing solely on factors internal to the believer's mind will inevitably lead to a mistaken account of justification. Probably right. The alternative, then, is that at least some factors external to the believer's mind determine whether or not she is justified. A proponent of such a view is called an externalist. Suppose that my belief that Hershey's stock will fall is based on my beliefs that Karen told me so, and that Karen is a reliable indicator of these things. Not every belief of mine is supported by other beliefs I have. These kinds of beliefs are called basic beliefs, beliefs that are not supported by other beliefs. Consider your belief that there's a cube on the table. What reason do you have for this belief? It might be difficult to say. Yet internalism requires that you have some reason, typically the content of one's experience, that supports this belief if that belief is rational. Externalists think that that is just too tall of an order. According to externalism, the only way to avoid the isolation objection and ensure that knowledge does not include luck is to consider some factors other than the individual's other beliefs. So which factors then should be considered? The most prominent version of externalism, called reliabilism, suggests that we consider the source of the belief. Beliefs can be formed as a result of many different sources, such as sense experience, reason, testimony, memory. More precisely, we might specify which sense we used, who provided the testimony, what sort of reasoning is used, or how recent the relevant memory is. For every belief, we can indicate the cognitive processes that led to its formation. In its simplest and most straightforward form, reliabilism maintains that whether or not a belief is justified depends whether that process is a reliable source of true beliefs. So since we are seeking a match between our mind and the world, justified beliefs are those which result from processes which regularly achieve such a match. For example, using vision to determine the color of an object which is well lit and relatively near is a reliable belief-forming process for a person with normal vision, but not for a colorblind person. So forming beliefs on the basis of the testimony of an expert is likely to yield true beliefs, but forming beliefs on the basis of the testimony of compulsive liars is not. But we also know that sometimes two different expert witnesses give conflicting reports, and sometimes liars tell the truth. In general, if a belief is the result of a cognitive process which reliably, most of the time we still want to leave room for human fallibility, leads to true belief, then that belief is justified. The foregoing suggests one immediate challenge, though, for reliabilism. The formation of a belief is a one-time event, but the reliability of the process depends upon the long-term performance of the process. This can include counterfactual as well as actual events. For instance, a coin which is flipped only once and lands on heads nonetheless has a 50% chance of landing on tails, even though its actual performance has yielded heads 100% of the time in that one flip. And this requires that we specify which process is being used so that we can evaluate its performance in other instances. However, cognitive processes can be described in more or less general terms. For example, the same belief-forming process might be variously described as sense experience, vision, vision by a normally sighted person, vision by a normally sighted person in daylight, vision by a normally sighted person in daylight while looking at a tree, vision by a normally sighted person in daylight while looking at an elm tree, and so forth. The generality problem notes that some of these descriptions might specify a reliable process, but others might specify an unreliable process, so that we cannot know whether a belief is justified or unjustified unless we know the appropriate level of generality to use in describing the process. If it's just an idea of, well, I saw a tree, I know it's an elm tree, but you don't know more, did you see it in the dark? Did you see it from 100 yards away? Did you see it and you know nothing about trees? There's a whole lot of other information we might need there. Even if the generality problem can be solved, another problem remains for externalism. Keith Allaire presents the problem by way of his example of Mr. True Temp. So True Temp has, unbeknownst to him, had a tempucomp, a device which accurately reads the temperature and causes a spontaneous belief about the temperature implanted in his brain. As a result, he has many true beliefs about the temperature, but he does not know why he has them or what their source is. Lair argues that although True-Temp's belief-forming process is reliable, his ignorance of the temp-comp renders his temperature beliefs unjustified, and thus that a reliable cognitive process cannot yield justification unless the believer is aware of the fact that the process is reliable. Isn't that fun? In other words, the mere fact that the process is reliable does not suffice, Lair concludes, to justify any beliefs which are formed via that process. You have to know what the process is and know it's reliable. Well, that's a lot. So we've talked about propositional knowledge and the justification of belief which leads to true knowledge. You have to have reason for a belief. And sometimes you have to understand, well, why do you have that reason? Is that a good reason? How do we know that that reason is good? So next week, we're going to talk about the extent of human knowledge. How much can we actually know? So as always, if you have any questions, any ideas, send them my way. I also am interested in maybe having a Zoom conversation sometime pretty soon. Then after we've had a few of these lessons, we can kind of get together and chat more about them. Hope you have a great week.